Hi everyone, thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm Lucie Laurendon, I'm Head of Product Marketing for our supply product at Smart, and I will be assisted today by Benoît Hucafol, our Head of Product for the supply.
Hi everyone.
So last September, Apple released iOS 14, and with the rollout of their app tracking framework just around the corner, the time to start preparing is now. As this is a lot of information to process in this webinar, we will help you to understand the upcoming changes due to the ATT framework release, the potential consequences for publishers' monetization, and action you can take to limit this impact. So before starting, just want to give you some messages. So all mics and cameras are automatically turned off. A Q&A session is planned at the end, so you will have time to ask all your questions during the presentation. Please type your question in the Q&A box on the right part of your screen, and we will take 15 minutes in the end of the presentation to answer all your questions. So first of all, ATT framework and its impact. We know that the ATT framework will change the advertising game, and there's no doubt about it. And it has started to make noise in the ad tech ecosystem since the announcement of Apple. We can't deliver this webinar and ignore, for example, what is happening on the market. For example, this announcement already launched the war over data privacy between Apple and Facebook. The social network has discussed an antitrust lawsuit against Google, accusing Apple of anti-competitive action in the App Store. More locally, in France, for example, 4 online advertising lobbies have filed an antitrust complaint against Google, saying the changes brought by Apple did not meet European Union privacy rules. We are all aware of all these events and that these news may impact what we will deliver during this webinar. However, at Smart, we think that we need to educate the market and help you regarding this new framework, and we strongly advise you to get prepared now. So in early spring, Apple is going to release the app tracking transparency framework. What are the rules for this new framework? The app tracking framework is Apple IDFA Opt-In mechanism introduced by iOS 14. This mechanism will request user authorization to access app-related data. So each app that collects data about end users and sharers will have to implement this framework. It will require publishers to ask the user for consent to collect and share data. Permission must be granted to track the device. User will see a prompt to allow the sharing of their personal information on their device with third parties when accessing the app for the first time. Before starting, some figures about iOS 14 traffic at Smart. For now, 37% of Smart in-app revenue are generated on an iOS device at Smart. iOS 14 represents 84% of iOS global revenue. And 92% of traffic with no ATT status. This means that our publishers did not implement yet the ATT framework. And 8% of the traffic is refused or restricted. So only few publishers have already implemented the ATT framework. So for now, we just have few benchmarks regarding consent rates. And now what will change with the ATT framework? With iOS 14, you will need to receive the user's permission through the App Tracking Transparency Framework to track them or access their device advertising identifier, their IDFA. This means that to gain access to this IDFA and perform certain tracking, your app must prompt a user with the ATT pop-up that you see on the screen. This Apple prompt will have an explanatory text that you can customize a little bit to enable the user to accept or refuse to be tracked. A user can specifically decline access to his personal information with the button Do Not Track. Another thing that you should know is that a user can prevent access to personal information to all apps within its settings, once and for all. And if the user changes his mind, he will have to go in his mobile settings to update this choice. So what the impact will be for you as a publisher? The main impact of the ATT framework is that access to the IDFA will be blocked until the user gives consent to be tracked. This is an opt-in process, so by default, you won't have access to the IDFA until you implemented the framework and obtain user consent. If you do not implement the framework, you won't have access to the IDFA when the user will upgrade his mobile to the latest version of iOS. Publishers will have to update and submit their apps to comply with the new framework. Just a few information about European Economic Area. As you may know, in Europe, there is a CMP process to request the consent of the user to share its data. And for publishers operating in this area, this consent prompt does not prevent requesting a user consent following the transparency and consent framework. So ATT prompt is an additional step to the CMP prompt. It won't remove the CMP prompt. Some use case to give a little bit more detail and the impact with the CMP prompt. First use case, you can show the CMP prompt. If the user said yes to the CMP, then you can show the ATT prompt to get his answer. If he says yes as well to the ATT prompt, you will get access to the IDFA of the user. Use case number 2, you will show the CMP prompt. The user says yes to the CMP prompt. He gave his consent, but when you're going to show the ATT prompt, he said no. In this case, even if the user told you yes to the CMP prompt, you won't get access to the IDFA. Use case number 3, if it is a no to the CMP prompt, even if he says yes to the ATT prompt, you won't get access to the IDFA. And the worst case, he will say no to both prompts, and then you won't get access to the IDFA. What you have to remind here is that to get access to the IDFA of the user, you need to get both yes to each prompt, CMP and ATT. That's only valid for European traffic. So why IDFA is that critical for app monetization? IDFA, Identifier for Advertiser, is a unique identifier generated by iOS. It is unique to the user device and shared across all apps and third-party vendors. IDFA is shared in the programmatic funnel and transmitted to buyers in the bid request, as well as in impression, click, or app install. So it will enable publisher to track impression, click, and app install. Some use cases that are enabled thanks to IDFA Thanks to IDFA, you are able to do frequency capping, audience data targeting, and attribution measurement across apps. No access to IDFA will then prevent you to identify the users, will prevent third-party and external SDK such as Smart One to identify the user, or to deliver advertising use cases such as attribution measurement or audience targeting. In conclusion, implementing the app tracking and transparency framework is then critical to keep delivering high-value advertising use cases for you and your buyers. Now, 4 steps that publishers that you must take to comply with the ATT framework. First of all, as I already told you, you will have to update your app to integrate the ATT framework. And then you will have to submit it to Apple. Second, a new step that is now required by Apple is that you have to declare the data collected by your app. Apple requires you to disclose the user data that your app is collecting and the purpose of this collection. Not only the data that you collect, but also, for example, as a Smart Display SDK collects some user data, you must also declare the additional data collected by your app. And you have a link to a documentation here. Smart can explain you how to declare this data. Then, a strong recommendation that we have for you is that you should update your Smart SDK. For sure, previous Smart SDK will still work with Apple's ATT framework. But if you want to access some information about reporting on ATT performance, for example, on consent rate, we strongly advise you to get the latest version of Smart SDK, SDK 7.8. That will really help you to follow the performance on ATT framework. And the last point is that once your ATT framework is integrated, you're not done because you will have to optimize the ATT prompt experience to maximize your opt-in rates. For sure, you will have, and that's why we really strongly advise you to integrate ATT framework as soon as possible, because the work is really on the ATT prompt experience, and you will have to optimize this experience. And Benoit will tell you how.
Thanks, Lucy. So as Lucy explained, it's critical to implement the framework and more importantly to maximize the chance to get an opt-in rate. And I'll explain you here some strategies about how to optimize it. So some prior information to know when you implement the ATT framework. First one is that you will get only one chance to ask the user about the consent. And so the user will provide the information and it will be stored once and for all in the mobile settings. And there won't be any chance to resubmit this ATT prompt. The only option for the user to update the consent will be to go into the mobile settings, which we all know is a long and complex process, so very unlikely that the user will do it. Second point is that you cannot incentivize the user to get their opt-in. And so, for example, if you would like to block access to your app or to some content of your app or to some advanced feature in exchange of the user opt-in, this won't be possible, and Apple will prevent you from doing that. The third point is that the ATT framework is meant for IDFA, but it's also meant to prevent the use of any shared ID with third party that can be used to track the user. So if you are considering to use an HTML or ID solution in the replacement of IDFA if the user didn't provide the consent, this is forbidden by the Apple policy. As well as using fingerprinting methods. So ATT framework is meant for enabling or like having the user consent to track and share his personal information with a third party. And the last point about the risks, if you don't comply with that rule, is that your app can be rejected from the App Store, which I guess would be even more critical than not having access to the IDFA. So now some tips to improve the opt-in rates. One of our recommendation is to use a soft prompt. So what we call a soft prompt is kind of a pre-view page where you will explain the user with more details about why it's important that the user gives consent. And this soft prompt will give you the opportunity to provide much more information than the Apple ones can offer you. So this soft prompt will also be a way for you to get a second chance, because one possible journey you can offer to user is to ask the user in the soft prompt if he's ready to consent to share his personal data, and if he's not ready, to not display the ATT pop-up. And so this way, you won't use your only chance to get the user consent. And so this soft prompt can filter only on the user that's more inclined to accept on the ATT prompts. So if you're based in Europe and if you don't want to implement a soft prompt because of lack of resources or complexity, we at least recommend you to display your CMP before the ATT prompt to allow you to not display the ATT prompt if the user didn't provide a positive consent to the CMP. This way, you will be able to display again the CMP after a period of time. And if you get a chance to get the positive consent in the second time you display the CMP, then you will be able to display the ATT prompt. As Lucy explained, it's not. You need to have both positive consent to access the IDFA. So using the CMP could be a way to only ask for the ATT consent if the user gave a positive consent to the CMP. And the last point about the second chance, which is probably a bit more complex, is to explain the user how they can access their mobile settings to update their consent if they finally want to allow you to share personal data. The third advice is to think about when is the right moment to display the ATT prompt. So you will be able to trigger the display of the ATT prompt whenever you want. So this doesn't necessarily need to be when the user first opened your app for the first time. It could be any time that you feel it's the moment where you likely have the more chance to get the consent. So what we would recommend is to wait that the user understand and perceive the value of your app. So let him browse a few pages, or let him visit several times your app, or before accessing a valuable content, before asking him to know if he's ready to share his personal information. Because what we noticed that the user are more inclined to share his personal data if he perceives the value of your app. And the last tips is to find the right message. It's important to test and on all of these aspects, but most importantly on the messaging, as the way you explain the user can drive different adoption rates in terms of consent. You also need to think about the wordings that you will use. If you speak about tracking, it's probably the user will be less inclined to share his personal data compared if you speak, for example, about personalization. So to give you an example of a soft prompt that we get from one of the probably most used app in the world is the Facebook one. Where you see that Facebook decided to implement this kind of system where they explain the user about the value of sharing his personal data to access personalized ads. And as you can see, there are two options which are allow or don't allow. and so if the user clicks on allow, then the soft prompt will be opened and the user will be asked to accept to be tracked. And if the user don't allow, Facebook will be able to resubmit this soft prompt until the user is ready to allow personalized tracking. So some advice on this specific screen. First one is to use short message. We all know that people don't like to read lots of text, so be short and sharp in your messages. Explain the reason why it's important to accept to be tracked in the app and what will be the benefits of the user, and also explain about the value exchange that you propose to the user to access free content in exchange to his personalized profile. If you can do as much as A/B testing as you can to define the right messaging and the right look and feel of the soft prompt that drives the highest opt-in rate. For sure, make sure that these soft prompts match your app look and feel. Again, this is the opportunity to explain to the user why it's important to share his personal data. So this also needs to make the user feel it's when he will share his and accept to share his personal data is because it's for your app and your app only. You can try other formats like images, icons. You can even try a video or like a message, like 5 reasons why the user should accept being tracked. And lastly, which relates to the look and feel, it's important to think that the soft prompt will be the background of the ATT prompt. So also keep in mind that it's important to have appealing colors or the content that will be displayed behind the prompt, the ATT prompt, could drive a higher opt-in rate. So we've put together an example of what could be the user journey you can test and when could be the right moment to ask the ATT framework, ATT prompt. So one of this journey could be first to not display the prompt at the first visit. So just keep in mind that in the meantime, you won't have access to the IDFA, as IDFA will be by default removed until the user gave the consent. But if in the end this drives a higher opt-in rate, you probably prefer to not to lose the IDFA for a few page viewed and get it for forever afterwards. So that's why it's important to submit it at the right moment. So after a few page views that you can test and define, display the soft prompt and in the look and feel of your app, explain the reason why it's important to share personal information with 2 options to accept or deny, or allow and not allow. So if the user says yes, then you can display him the ATT prompt because you can imagine that it will be ready to accept and more inclined to share his personal data. If the user says no, then you can close the soft prompt and leave the user browsing your app until a next visit. On the next visit, you will be able to display the soft prompt again, maybe also make the messaging evolve to explain a bit more, or give more context or content explaining the user why it's important to share his personal data. And again, if the user says yes, then display the ATT prompt, and if says no, leave him without sharing his personal data.
Thank you, Benoit. So we hope that with all these tips and suggestions, you will get the highest opt-in rate as possible. But in case you don't get the consent of the user or until you implement the ATT framework, what are the alternatives to monetize your app inventory without IDFA? So at Smart, we work on that. And we are delivering some targeting capabilities without ID and enrich the offer to your buyers to maintain their campaign performance. So we developed 3 targeting capabilities. The first one is semantic contextual targeting that is available through our smart data marketplace that is natively integrated within our SDK. The semantic contextual targeting will be available early Q2. So smart proprietary natural language processes algorithm uses artificial intelligence to analyze the true meaning of our publisher's content page in real time. Each page is categorized and added in a thematic segments that are directly available for targeting in smart platforms. You have more than 200 categories available in 7 languages. This way, you can realize greater value of your inventory. This powerful targeting will be available through PMP direct deals, PG and auction package, and direct campaigns. 2 other options that are already available for targeting. The first one is smart predicted views, viewability prediction. It's also a smart proprietary prediction algorithm based on a deep learning approach, and it's a real-time prediction at the ad call level. What we are doing, we are taking into account 25 parameters to predict the viewability and select the deals based on the viewability target. This way, you're going to be able to build your PMP with a guaranteed minimum of viewability rates. You will sell your viewable impression at their true cost and with confidence. The first targeting capabilities is video completion prediction. Also, we are working on deep learning predictor output. A deep learning predictor will output the probability for the video to be seen completely in less than 2 minutes. This way, you will be able to build your private marketplace, so only direct deal and private auction. And now how to use smart semantic contextual that will be available early Q2. So we will give the publishers the possibility to pass the equivalent web URL of the app page in the ad call. This means that you have the same contents on your web page than on your app. It will only work in this case. In case the apps are really a mirrors of the website. The URL are sourced this way, and they will be categorized by our semantic contextual algorithm, and we will this way allow contextual targeting on in-app. You will find back your URL directly in your contextual segment. So you will be able to target your content directly in your campaign or your deal. And we are also working for now, it's still under tech assessment, but we are also working on a semantic classification in real time within our SDK. Our product team is evaluating the ability to run semantic categorization algorithm directly within the app through our SDK. For now, it's still under tech assessment because we need to consider several things as it's for apps and not having a bad experience. And we take into consideration, for example, CPU usage, the impact on battery consumption, the impact on ad loading time, because we know that on a device, on a mobile device, we need to take user experience into consideration to see if we can launch semantic classification through our SDK.
One other option is to work with your first-party ID. So on this front, it's still unclear what will be allowed or not by Apple, and they have not officially communicated about that. But in some press articles, they said that at some point, first-party ID could be used outside of the ATT framework, as again the ATT framework is meant to track user from a third party and across apps, and as a first party ID is limited to one and single app, this could work outside of the ATT framework. So this could work with or without the user consent on the ATT prompt. So Smart will allow you to pass first party ID within the SDK in the add call to Smart, in addition to the IDFA. So this so you will be able to pass both, and IDFA when you have it, and the first party ID when you don't. You can already use one or the other, but if you don't want, and if you want to benefit from both, when both will be available, early Q2 will be able to push that through our SDK. We also use a temporary ID that is generated by our SDK during 24 hours and unique to an application to enable the frequency mapping on the ad server side. This is activated by default, and you can block it if you want Smart to prevent using this temporary ID. So some things to keep in mind if you consider to use a first-party ID. Again, the ATT framework is meant to prevent tracking of user across apps. So the first-party ID shouldn't be one that can be used for this purpose. And so, for example, we recommend to use a unique CRM ID or an ID generated by your app rather than a hashed email that can be shared across multiple apps. So this ID won't be, enable you to deliver all use cases, and especially the one to measure conversion and attribution across apps. And the one last consideration is, if you want to go this way, is that it has to go with a direct sales approach through a ad served campaign or deals and on programmatic guaranteed, as buyer will mostly need and rely on IDFA for open market. And to finish on and go beyond this topic to talk about IDFV and SK and ad network. So IDFV is pretty much similar to a first-party ID, as it's a unique identifier available to the apps of the same vendor, and that won't be shared across multiple apps. So on this one also, Apple didn't make it clear if it can be used or not as a replacement for the IDFA. What is sure is that it cannot be used in combination with other data to track the user, again, because the ATT framework is meant to ask the user permission to be tracked. So if you want to use it, we also enable you to pass this information as a parameter of the ad call, in addition to the IDFA or your first-party ID, and this will also be available in early Q2. We also look at pushing this IDFV to buyers in the bid requests to enable them to also take some decision based on it. But we are waiting for that to see how Apple will react if some publishers are using it, and if it should be restricted to the ad server, or as its first party, it could be considered as a first party ID, or if it can be passed to a DSP through a bid request. And again, as the same as for the first party ID, this won't cover all the advertising use cases, and especially the cross app attribution measurement. And speaking about that, so Apple made the ASK and network framework available to enable cross-app conversion tracking. So this framework is today quite limited, as it's only meant to track app installs across apps. So in terms of the coverage, it's mostly meant for publishers or buyers wanting to deliver ads about app install or measure conversion and attribution of app installs from a campaign. so which is mostly targeted to gaming publishers or advertisers. And there are also lots of limitations in terms of matching this conversion with the campaign, in terms of delay to measure the conversion and attribution. So it's quite limited framework at this stage. And on our side, we are currently evaluating the implementation of the framework, especially how this framework will be adopted by the market, and of course, if publishers or buyers want to use it. But as for now, as we work mostly with premium publishers and that don't necessarily deliver this kind of campaign, it didn't appear as a top priority. So 3 takeaways. So ATT framework is a requirement for publishers to be able to access the IDFA. And so by default, the IDFA won't be available until the framework will be implemented. So it's critical for publishers to implement the framework to keep having access to the IDFA. And the last point, think about how you can optimize your customer journey and your user journey to maximize the opt-in rate you can get on the IDFA.
Thank you, Benoit. And so we hope that we answer all your questions, but if you still have some questions, please type them directly in the Q&A box and we will answer it now. So we have a first question, Benoit. So do you have some first figures to share about the consent rate that some of your publishers could get?
So yeah, we have very limited numbers at this stage as the framework is being adopted. For very few of them who started to push the framework or tested it, it's very it varies a lot from some that have a very low opt-in rate around like 10% to others that have a consent rate around like 50 or 60%. So it's yeah, we don't have enough stats today to evaluate it, but yeah, I think we can expect to have at least half of the user providing the consent.
Thank you, Benoit. I'm not sure we have a lot of questions, but do not hesitate to type it now. We will let you just a few minutes to do. I'm sure we were all clear. But in case you have questions after the webinar, you have our both emails on the slides, so do not hesitate to take a note of our email and send us some questions if you have some when you're gonna implement your framework. Or for smart customers, do not hesitate also to reach out to your CAMs and TAMs if you need more information.